Hello there and welcome to the Sleepy Wealth Stories. Tonight we are tracing the long and remarkable history of taxation, following the thread that connects ancient grain collectors in the Nile Delta to the digital tax debates of the present day. We begin in a world lit by oil lamps and firelight, where scribes pressed reed styluses into wet clay and recorded, in careful columns, what every household owed to the state. There is something quietly profound about the fact that the oldest surviving financial records in human history are tax records. Before anyone thought to write down a poem, before armies carved their victories into stone, administrators were already tracking who had paid and who had not. Taxation is older than money, older than markets, older than almost every institution we think of as modern. It is the shadow that has followed every civilization, the invisible architecture beneath every empire, every kingdom, every republic that has ever asked its people to contribute something to the common cause. To study the history of taxation is to study the history of trust and the history of its absence. Every tax system ever devised rests on a negotiation, spoken or unspoken, between those who govern and those who are governed. In some eras that negotiation was direct and brutal, pay or face the sword. In others it was elaborate and philosophical, wrapped in constitutional language and the rhetoric of consent. But the basic question has never changed. What do we owe to one another, and who gets to decide? The answers that different societies gave to that question shaped everything. They determined whether empires expanded or collapsed. They sparked revolutions in France and America. They gave birth to parliaments and income taxes and offshore bank accounts hidden behind layers of legal fiction. They built roads and schools and navies. They also, in the wrong hands, stripped peasants of their last grain, turned neighbours into informants and drove populations to ruin. Tonight we will walk through all of it, slowly, without hurry, the way you might trace a river from its source to the sea. We will visit tax collectors in ancient Egypt and merchant cities in Renaissance Italy. We will sit in the chambers where English nobles confronted their kings, and in the taverns where American colonists argued about stamps and tea. We will follow taxation through industrialization and depression and 2 world wars, through the rise of the welfare state and the age of globalization, until we arrive at where we stand today, in a world where a corporation can exist everywhere and be taxed almost nowhere. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, let your shoulders soften and your breathing slow. Let the day loosen its grip, and allow your thoughts to drift back through time as we explore the long and remarkable history of taxation. Let's begin. The earliest known tax records were written in Sumer more than 5,000 years ago, long before coins existed or empires had names. In the ancient city of Ur, in what is now southern Iraq, scribes worked in rooms of clay brick temples and pressed wedge-shaped marks into tablets the size of a human hand. These marks were not poetry or prayer. They were receipts. They recorded the delivery of barley, sheep, fish oil, and wool, contributions from farms and households, to the temple granaries that fed priests, laborers, and administrators. What we call the temple economy of ancient Sumer was, in practice, the world's first tax system. The surplus extracted from farmers flowed upward through layers of officials into the central store, and from there it was redistributed, carefully and unequally, to sustain the city and its rulers. What is striking about these early records is not just their antiquity but their precision. Ur's scribes tracked individual households. They noted the quantity delivered and the name of the payer. They knew who was late and who had paid in full. They had, in other words, already invented the fundamental mechanics of taxation: the assessment, the collection, the record, and the enforcement. Everything that came after, across 5 millennia, was in some sense a refinement of what those scribes were already doing by firelight in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. The grain collected was not simply stored. It moved through the city as a kind of currency, paying wages, funding festivals, supporting soldiers. The tax was the economy, and the economy was the tax. There was no clean line between the two, no market that existed separately from the state's appetite. This integration of extraction and redistribution is something that every subsequent civilization would grapple with, sometimes elegantly, sometimes catastrophically. Ancient Egypt refined taxation into an art form, building one of the most sophisticated revenue systems the ancient world had ever seen. The Nile made Egypt uniquely legible to its administrators. Every year the river flooded, and when it receded it left behind a dark band of fertile silt that could be measured, mapped, and taxed with extraordinary precision. Egyptian officials, called scribes of the fields, walked the land after each flood with measuring ropes, assessing the quality and extent of the cultivable soil. From these assessments, they calculated what each plot of land should yield, and what fraction of that yield the pharaoh was owed. The system was so refined that it accounted for years of poor flooding, adjusting demands downward when the harvest would be thin. This was not generosity, it was pragmatism. A tax collector who stripped a farmer of his seed grain would have nothing to collect the following year. Egypt also collected taxes in the form of labor. Every able-bodied man was liable for a period of compulsory service to the state, building the infrastructure that held the empire together: irrigation canals, roads, military fortifications, and famously the pyramids themselves. These monuments, so often described as wonders of human achievement, were also monuments to fiscal organization. Thousands of workers, fed from state granaries, provided with beer and bread and linen, extracted from villages across the Nile Valley and put to work on the pharaoh's projects. Their labor was their tax, rendered not in grain but in years. What Egypt understood, and what later empires would learn the hard way, is that an effective tax system requires more than force. It requires information. The scribes who walked the fields with their measuring ropes were doing something that we would today call data collection. They were building the map that made the state possible. Without that knowledge of who owned what, where, and how much it produced, no government could tax with any consistency. The history of taxation is, in no small part, the history of the state learning to see. In ancient Rome, taxation became an instrument of empire, funding the legions, the roads, and the elaborate bureaucracy that held a quarter of the world's population under a single administration. Rome's tax system evolved over centuries, shaped by conquest and crisis. In the early Republic, Roman citizens paid a direct tax called the tributum, assessed on their property and collected during times of war to fund the armies. This was a civic obligation, understood by those who paid it as a contribution to collective defense. When Rome expanded and the spoils of conquest began flowing in, the tributum was suspended for Roman citizens entirely. For over a century, free citizens of Rome paid no direct tax at all. The empire was so profitable that its own people became exempt. The provinces carried the burden instead. This arrangement created a political economy that shaped Rome's entire character. Conquered peoples paid tribute while Romans enjoyed the fruits of that tribute, funding a city of marble baths, amphitheaters, and grain distributions. Provincial governors, some of them spectacularly corrupt, oversaw the collection, often enriching themselves in the process. Tax farming became an institution. The state auctioned the right to collect taxes in a given province to private contractors, called publicans, who paid the government up front and then extracted as much as they could from the population. The gap between what a publican paid and what he collected was his profit. This created incentives that were, to put it gently, misaligned with the public interest. By the time of the late Empire, Rome had reversed course entirely. The conquests had stopped, the spoils had dried up, the military costs had grown enormous. Direct taxes returned, heavier than before, assessed on land and people across the entire empire. The burden fell hardest on the peasantry. And in many provinces, it contributed to a spiral that historians still debate: tax pressure, falling productivity, depopulation, and eventual collapse. Rome did not fall from taxation alone, but it fell in part from what happens when the cost of governing exceeds what governing makes possible. The ancient Chinese state developed one of the most elaborate and enduring tax systems in history, built on population registers, land surveys, and the philosophical conviction that the emperor's mandate rested on his people's welfare. China's Zhou dynasty, over 3,000 years ago, already operated a system of taxation tied to land productivity and household size. By the time of the Han dynasty, roughly contemporary with Rome at its height, the Chinese state was assessing taxes on land, on commerce, and on individual adults, using census records of astonishing sophistication. The Han government counted heads, recorded ages, tracked occupations, and used that information to calculate what each household owed. It was, in scale and ambition, perhaps the most comprehensive population accounting exercise the ancient world had attempted. What set Chinese taxation apart was the philosophical framework that surrounded it. Confucian thought placed the relationship between ruler and people at the center of political legitimacy. A ruler who taxed too heavily was not merely inefficient, he was immoral, violating the covenant that gave him the right to rule. This idea that excessive taxation was a sign of failing virtue recurred through Chinese history as a kind of moral break on fiscal appetite. Dynasties that lost popular support often did so in the language of oppressive taxation, and reform movements frequently framed themselves as a return to lighter, more just burdens. The most famous attempt to rethink Chinese taxation came during the Song dynasty in the 11th century, when the reformer Wang Anshi proposed a sweeping reorganization of the state's finances. His green sprout loans, low-interest credit extended to farmers before the harvest, were designed to free peasants from predatory private lenders and create a new revenue stream for the state. His land survey reforms attempted to reassess property values and spread the tax burden more fairly. The reforms were bold, contested, and ultimately dismantled by his opponents. Wang Anshi's failure is a story that would replay across many centuries and many civilizations. Ambitious reform, entrenched interest, reversal. The tax system, once built, resisted change with a stubbornness that outlasted most of the people who tried to alter it. The practice of tithing, giving 1/10 of one's income or harvest to the church, created a parallel system of fiscal extraction that operated alongside, and sometimes in competition with, secular taxation throughout the medieval world. The tithe is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, where it appears as an obligation owed to the Levites, the priestly class who served the temple and received no inheritance of land. 10% of the harvest, 10% of the flock, rendered year after year to sustain those who served the sacred. It is a very old idea, with roots deeper than any specific religious tradition. Scholars have found similar proportional obligations in Mesopotamian records. But it was the Christian Church that institutionalized the tithe across much of Europe, eventually making it a legal requirement enforced by ecclesiastical courts, and when necessary, by secular authorities acting on the church's behalf. For medieval peasants, the tithe was experienced less as a spiritual obligation than as another hand reaching into the granary. They owed the lord of the manor his share. They owed the king or prince his share when called upon, and they owed the church its 10th on top of everything else. In prosperous times, this burden was manageable. In lean years, when the harvest failed, when soldiers passed through the village and took what they needed, when disease thinned the livestock, it could be devastating. The layers of obligation that pressed down on a medieval farmer can be difficult to fully imagine from the comfort of the present. What is not difficult to imagine is the resentment that built, slowly and quietly, across generations. The church was not simply a collector. It was also a redistributor, running hospitals, schools, and poor relief on the revenues it gathered. In a world without a state capable of providing those services, the church's fiscal apparatus served a genuine social function, but it also accumulated vast wealth, cathedrals, monasteries, libraries, and that wealth became a target, politically and morally, for reformers who argued that the church had lost sight of its origins. The challenge to the tithe would eventually become part of the larger challenge to the church's authority that we call the Reformation. Feudalism organized medieval Europe's economy around a web of obligation and service that was, at its core, a system of taxation in everything but name. Under feudalism, land was held from the king by nobles, who held it in exchange for military service. Below the nobles, knights held land in exchange for their own service. Below the knights, peasants worked the land in exchange for protection and the right to farm. Every link in this chain was a transaction, not in money, but in labor, loyalty, and military obligation. The peasant owed the lord the 3 days a week of work on his fields, called the corvée. The lord owed the king soldiers and supplies when summoned. Money barely entered into it at the lower levels. What makes this a tax system, even if contemporaries would not have used that word, is that it transferred surplus from those who produced it to those who controlled the land, and, through the land, the political order. The peasant who spent 3 days each week farming the lord's domain was, in economic terms, handing over roughly 40% of his labor, a marginal rate that would make any modern tax reformer blush. He received something in return: security, the right to farm his own strips, access to the lord's mill, but the bargain was not struck between equals, and the terms were not negotiable. As medieval economies began to commercialize, as towns grew, trade expanded, and money became more common, this system of obligation began to show its seams. Lords who needed cash, not labor, began to commute the corvée into money payments. Peasants who could sell their surplus at market began to accumulate small reserves of coin. The fixed obligations of feudalism, designed for a world of subsistence agriculture, started to clash with a world that was becoming, slowly and unevenly, a market economy. Out of that tension over several centuries emerged the modern tax, a payment in money, assessed on income or property, collected by an increasingly bureaucratic state. The Magna Carta of 1215 established a principle that would become the foundation of constitutional taxation across the English-speaking world. The king could not levy taxes without the consent of those who paid them. King John of England was not a popular man. He had lost English territories in France, quarrelled with the Pope, and made enemies of nearly every powerful noble in the country. When he attempted to levy a new tax to fund another failed military campaign, a coalition of barons had finally had enough. They forced the king to meet them at a field called Runnymede beside the Thames, and there they presented him with a document. John, pressed on all sides, set his seal to it. What that document said, among many other things, was that no scutage, no tax, could be imposed without the common council of the realm. The king could not simply take, he had to ask. This principle, no taxation without representation, as it would later be distilled, did not emerge fully formed from Magna Carta. The barons who wrote it were not thinking of ordinary people. They were thinking of themselves, of their own rights and privileges, of the king's tendency to squeeze the nobility whenever he needed money. The broader implications of what they had written would take centuries to develop, argued over in parliaments and courts and pamphlets, until they became the bedrock of what we now call constitutional government. But the seed was there. The idea that the power to tax required the consent of the taxed, that extraction could not be purely unilateral, was a genuinely radical notion when placed against the backdrop of most of human history. Most rulers in most times had taxed because they could, because they had the power to compel. Runnymede said something different. It said that legitimacy mattered, that even a king operated within limits, and that those limits could be written down and pointed to when they were violated. The whole of modern democratic finance traces a line back, however indirectly, to that wet field in June 1215. The Italian city-states of the Renaissance invented financial instruments that transformed how governments funded themselves, moving from direct extraction to the more sophisticated mechanism of public debt. Florence, Venice, and Genoa in the 13th and 14th centuries faced a fiscal problem that was essentially modern. They needed money faster than taxes could deliver it. Wars arrived suddenly. Trade opportunities required immediate capital. The slow drip of annual revenues could not keep pace with the sudden demands of a city-state operating in a competitive and often violent world. The solution they found was to borrow from their own citizens by issuing bonds that promised repayment with interest. Venice's Monte Vecchio, established in 1262, was one of the earliest formalized public debt systems in Europe. The Venetian government compelled wealthy citizens to lend it money, issuing in return certificates that bore interest and could be sold to other citizens. What began as a forced loan gradually became something stranger and more interesting: a market. People bought and sold these government certificates, speculating on Venice's creditworthiness, pricing in their expectations about war and peace and trade. The secondary market in public debt, the idea that a government's promise to pay could itself be traded like a commodity, was being born. Florence took this further. The Monte Commune, established in 1345, consolidated the city's various debts into a single fund and issued shares to creditors. These shares, called prestans, paid interest and could be transferred between owners. They were in recognizable form government bonds. The wealthy families of Florence, the Medici, the Strozzi, the Albizzi, held large quantities of these obligations. They had a financial stake in the city's solvency. This alignment of private wealth with public fiscal health created a class of people who wanted strong, stable government, not merely as a matter of civic virtue, but as a matter of personal profit. The creditor class was born, and it would be one of the most powerful forces in the fiscal history of the modern world. Poll taxes, flat charges assessed on every adult head, were among the most ancient and most despised forms of taxation, levied by rulers across the world, and resisted with a fury that sometimes remade entire societies. A poll tax is the simplest imaginable fiscal instrument. Count the people, charge each one a fixed amount, collect it. It requires no complicated assessment of land quality or income. It makes no distinction between the prosperous and the destitute. Every head is worth the same amount to the collector. whether it belongs to a wealthy merchant or a landless laborer with nothing but his daily wage. This simplicity was, for administrators, enormously appealing. It was also, for the people who paid it, a source of profound grievance. England's Peasants' Revolt of 1381 is one of history's most vivid demonstrations of what happens when a poll tax pushes ordinary people past the point of endurance. The English crown, desperate for revenue to fund the 100 Years' War with France, had levied 3 poll taxes in quick succession. The third, in 1380, was particularly brutal, a flat rate of 1 shilling per adult, equivalent to several days' wages for a labourer. Tax collectors who found villages with suspiciously few adults, because people were hiding, were authorized to inspect the bodies of adolescents to determine whether they had crossed the threshold of adulthood. The indignity compounded the injustice. When the revolt came, it came fast and violent, led by figures including Wat Tyler and inspired by the preaching of the priest John Ball, who asked pointedly, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? Tens of thousands of peasants marched on London, burned documents recording feudal obligations, and briefly occupied the capital. The boy King Richard II met them at Smithfield. Wat Tyler was killed in circumstances that remain disputed. The revolt was suppressed, the poll tax quietly abandoned, the leaders hanged. But the lesson was not forgotten. 600 years later, when Margaret Thatcher's government introduced a community charge that critics immediately dubbed a poll tax, protesters in London remembered Wat Tyler, and the streets filled again. The development of customs duties and excise taxes in medieval and early modern Europe laid the groundwork for the modern fiscal state, creating revenue streams that could fund standing armies, permanent bureaucracies, and the beginning of what we recognize as national government. Customs, taxes on goods moving through ports and across borders, were among the oldest reliable revenues available to medieval rulers. England's kings discovered early that the wool trade offered a remarkably convenient tax base. Wool left through specific ports, it could be counted and valued, and the merchants who handled it were identifiable and settled. By the 13th century, England's customs on wool exports had become a major source of royal income, funding wars and endowing cathedrals with the proceeds of a commodity that seemed to produce itself, sheared from the backs of sheep grazing on English hills. Excise taxes, levies on specific goods consumed domestically, such as ale, salt, tobacco, and later alcohol, were more contentious. They reached deeper into ordinary life, touching the pleasures and necessities of people who had little else. The salt tax, the gabelle, was one of France's most hated fiscal instruments for centuries. Salt was not a luxury. It was a necessity of life, the only practical means of preserving food before refrigeration. Taxing it was, effectively, taxing the act of eating. The gabelle was applied unevenly. Different provinces paid different rates, and the inequity bred resentment that festered for generations. When the French Revolution finally came, abolishing the gabelle was one of the first and most popular acts of the new National Assembly. What these taxes shared beyond their economic function was their political significance. Customs and excise created fiscal bureaucracies, networks of collectors, inspectors, and officials whose careers depended on the smooth functioning of the tax system. These bureaucracies were, in a very real sense, the skeleton of the modern state, growing inside the older body of feudal obligation until they were strong enough to support a different kind of government entirely. The Spanish Empire's extraction of silver and gold from the Americas in the 16th century created a vast new revenue stream that transformed European finance and ultimately fueled inflation across a continent. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Americas, they found civilizations that had their own sophisticated systems of tribute and taxation. The Aztec Empire, the Inca Empire, each with their own mechanisms for extracting surplus from subject peoples. The Spanish did not dismantle these systems so much as redirect them. The existing tribute infrastructure was repurposed to serve the new masters, with indigenous administrators often continuing to collect what was owed and simply transferring it to Spanish officials rather than to Aztec or Inca authorities. What Spain ultimately extracted from the Americas was silver, above all else. The mines of Potosi, in what is now Bolivia, operating at altitude in brutal conditions by coerced indigenous labor under the meter system, produced quantities of silver that dwarfed anything previously available in Europe. Between the mid-16th and mid-17th centuries, something like 150,000 tons of silver flowed from the Americas to Spain. The crown took its fifth, the quinto real, the royal fifth, off the top of all mining production, creating a revenue stream that funded Spanish armies, Spanish debts, and Spanish ambitions across 2 continents. The economic consequences were both spectacular and destabilizing. So much new silver flooding into Europe drove prices upward in what historians call the price revolution, a sustained period of inflation that eroded the real incomes of wage workers and fixed-income landowners while enriching merchants who could adjust their prices. Spain itself, despite receiving enormous quantities of silver, found itself chronically in debt. The silver passed through Spanish hands and flowed outward to pay creditors in Antwerp and Genoa and Amsterdam. The lesson that would take centuries to fully absorb is that revenue and wealth are not the same thing, and that the capacity to tax is not the same as the capacity to manage what is collected. England's Stuart monarchs fought bitter and ultimately fatal battles with Parliament over the right to tax, a conflict that reshaped the English constitution, and through it, the entire trajectory of Western political thought. Charles I, who came to the throne in 1625, believed in his divine right to govern, to make war, to conduct diplomacy, to collect revenue, without being constrained by Parliament's consent. He was not uniquely arrogant for his time. The theory of absolute monarchy was, in much of 17th century Europe, the intellectual mainstream. But England had its peculiarities: a long tradition of parliamentary involvement in taxation, a common law culture that took legal precedent seriously, and a parliament that, unlike most of its continental equivalents, had managed to make itself genuinely indispensable to the business of government. When Charles tried to raise revenue without parliamentary approval, levying ship money in peacetime, collecting customs duties beyond Parliament's grant, the conflict moved quickly from constitutional theory to practical crisis. Parliament refused. Charles governed without Parliament for 11 years, the period known as the Personal Rule. When Scotland rebelled and Charles needed money for an army, he was forced to recall Parliament. The Parliament he recalled had a decade of grievances stored up, and it had no intention of simply handing the king what he wanted. The civil war that followed, the execution of Charles in 1649, the Republic, Cromwell, the Restoration, and finally the Glorious Revolution of 1688, all of this tumultuous sequence was at its root a prolonged argument about who had the right to tax. The Bill of Rights of 1689, which settled the matter in Parliament's favour, established what Magna Carta had only gestured toward, that taxation was not the king's prerogative. It required Parliament's consent. The principle was now constitutional bedrock. And because England's constitutional arrangements would spread through empire and influence to much of the world, this English settlement about tax and consent would echo in documents drafted on the other side of the Atlantic almost a century later. The Dutch Republic in the 17th century built the most sophisticated fiscal system of its era, combining public debt, taxation, and a central bank into an architecture that funded the first true commercial empire. The Netherlands in the 1600s was an improbable great power, a small wet country with no natural resources, no royal dynasty, no standing army to speak of, and a population that could fit comfortably into a single large province of France. What it had was financial innovation, extraordinary merchant acumen, and a tax system that its citizens trusted enough to fund through voluntary lending. The Dutch government could borrow at interest rates, sometimes as low as 4 or 5%, that its rivals could only dream of. England paid 8 or 10%, France paid 12 or more. Spain was perpetually in default. The Dutch could borrow cheaply because their creditors believed they would be repaid, and they believed that because the Dutch state had a track record of fiscal honesty and institutional accountability that no competitor could match. The Dutch States General, the representative assembly of the 7 united provinces, controlled taxation and approved debt issuances. Creditors who lent money to the Dutch state knew that a representative body stood behind the obligation, that political change would not simply void the debt at a monarch's whim. This credibility was not cheap. It was the product of institutional design, of transparency, and of a political culture that took financial obligations seriously. It was also the product of an excise tax system of remarkable comprehensiveness: beer, wine, grain, salt, soap, cloth, cattle, a web of small levies that together generated steady and predictable revenue. The Bank of Amsterdam, founded in 1609, provided the plumbing for all of this. offering secure deposit facilities and facilitating settlement between merchants in a city that handled goods from a dozen countries. It was not precisely a central bank in the modern sense, but it performed functions that would become central banking, stabilizing the money supply, providing a trusted medium of settlement, holding reserves. The Dutch had assembled, piece by piece, what we would now recognize as the institutional infrastructure of a modern financial state. Their neighbors watched and in time copied. The invention of the income tax in late 18th century Britain was born not of philosophical principle, but of desperate military necessity, as a nation at war searched for a way to fund its survival. William Pitt the Younger stood before the House of Commons in December 1798 and proposed something that his listeners found at first almost incomprehensible. He wanted to tax people not on their property, not on the goods they bought or sold, but on their income, on the money they received each year from all sources. The idea that the state had any business knowing what a citizen earned, let alone taking a percentage of it, struck many members of Parliament as an intolerable invasion. It was, in truth, a revolutionary concept, a tax that reached directly into the productive activity of individuals and claimed a share of what they produced. Pitt was not proposing this out of abstract fiscal theory. He was at war. Britain was fighting the French revolutionary armies that were sweeping across Europe, and the existing taxes were not generating enough revenue. The customs duties, the excise taxes, the land taxes, all of them together could not fund the military expansion that survival required. Something new was needed, something that could grow with national income rather than remaining fixed to the volume of goods traded or the area of land held. An income tax, graduated upward, Pitt proposed rates starting at 1 pence in the pound, and rising to 2 shillings would, he argued, reach the wealthy where they actually had resources. The income tax was introduced in 1799 and immediately recented. It was repealed in 1802 at the Peace of Amiens, then reintroduced in 1803 when war resumed, then repealed again with great ceremony in 1816, a year after Waterloo. Parliament ordered the records destroyed, but the idea did not die. It had proven too effective, too responsive to economic growth, too capable of generating the vast revenues that modern war and modern government required. It would return in Britain and eventually everywhere as the dominant instrument of modern public finance. The American Revolution transformed the philosophical argument about taxation into a founding myth, establishing no taxation without representation as one of the central principles of the new republic. The phrase itself predates the Revolution, borrowed from English constitutional tradition by colonial lawyers, who used it to argue that Parliament, in which no American colonists sat, had no right to impose taxes on American subjects. The argument was, legally speaking, debatable. Parliament claimed to represent all British subjects, however indirectly. But politically and emotionally, the argument resonated with a colonial population that had grown accustomed to managing its own affairs through local assemblies and resented London's attempts to tap its growing wealth. What set the conflict alight was not taxation in the abstract, but specific taxes on specific goods. The Stamp Act of 1765, which taxed printed documents of almost every kind. The Townshend Acts of 1767, which taxed glass, paper, paint, and tea. And finally the Tea Act of 1773, which gave the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies, undercutting colonial merchants even as it lowered the price. The Boston Tea Party, which was not a protest against high taxes, but against a policy that injured colonial business interests, has been simplified in popular memory into a pure cry for freedom. The reality was messier, as it usually is. Merchants and lawyers and farmers saw their economic interests threatened, reached for the available philosophical language, and discovered in the process that the philosophical language was more powerful than the economic grievances it had been recruited to serve. The constitution that the new republic eventually produced was, among other things, a document about taxation. It gave Congress the power to levy taxes, required that direct taxes be apportioned among the states according to population, prohibited export taxes, and demanded that all revenue measures originate in the House of Representatives, the body closest to the voters. These provisions reflected hard experience of what happens when taxation is separated from representation. They also contained compromises, the 3/5 clause, which counted enslaved people for apportionment purposes while denying them political standing, That would require a civil war, 3 constitutional amendments, and another century of struggle to begin unwinding. The French Revolution abolished the ancient regime's labyrinthine tax system overnight, replacing centuries of privilege and exemption with the radical principle that all citizens owed equal obligation to the state. France before 1789 had one of the most inequitable tax systems in Europe, and that inequity was not accidental. It was a monument to centuries of privilege. The nobility and the higher clergy, by their status, were exempt from the taille, the basic direct tax on commoners. They paid little or nothing on their vast landholdings. The peasantry and the urban poor, by contrast, faced a crushing overlay of obligations. The taille, the gabelle on salt, the aides on wine and beer, the corvée of road labour and the tithe to the church, all on top of feudal dues to their lords. The Bourbon monarchy, perpetually short of money, had tried repeatedly to reform this system, to tax the privileged classes who alone had the resources to provide meaningful revenue, and had been blocked each time by the parliaments, the aristocratic courts that registered royal decrees and had the power to refuse them. When the Estates General convened in May 1789, ostensibly to address the fiscal crisis that had brought France to the edge of bankruptcy, the Third Estate, the commoners, arrived with lists of grievances called cahiers de doléances. Tax inequity ran through them like a red thread. When the revolution came, the fiscal order went with it. On the night of August 4, 1789, in a remarkable session of the National Assembly that lasted until dawn, nobles rose one after another to renounce their privileges, their hunting rights, their feudal dues, their exemptions from taxation, whether from genuine revolutionary enthusiasm or fear of what was coming if they resisted. The privileged orders voted away their fiscal advantages in a matter of hours. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, adopted that August, stated plainly that taxation must be shared equally among all citizens in proportion to their means. The principle of progressive taxation, that those with more should contribute a larger fraction, was embedded in France's founding revolutionary document. That the revolution then descended into terror, war, and Napoleon did not erase what had been established in those first months. The idea of fiscal equality, once articulated at that scale, could not be entirely unwritten. Napoleon Bonaparte used taxation not just to fund his wars, but as an instrument of administrative modernization, creating the French fiscal state that would endure with modifications through the present day. Napoleon had little patience for the revolutionary improvisation that had characterized French finance in the 1790s. He wanted a state that worked efficiently, predictably, reliably. What he built was a prefectural system of local administration, a conseil d'etat to review legislation, a Bank of France to manage credit, and a tax system that combined the revolutionary principle of universal obligation with the administrative machinery needed to actually enforce it. The Code Napoleon rationalized property law in ways that made land taxation simpler. The creation of a professional tax administration, salaried officials, trained inspectors, consistent procedures, replaced the chaotic contracting out of the old regime. What Napoleon understood, more clearly than most of his predecessors, was that military power rested ultimately on fiscal power. His Grand Armée was the largest and most effective fighting force Europe had seen in centuries, and it was built on a foundation of tax receipts. The continental system that sought to exclude British goods from European markets was, at its core, a fiscal weapon, attempting to drain Britain of the customs revenue and commercial profits that funded the Royal Navy. The weapons of modern warfare, muskets and artillery and supply trains, required industrial production, and industrial production required money, and money required taxes. Napoleon grasped this chain of dependence with a strategist's clarity. The administrative systems Napoleon built outlasted his empire. When his armies swept across Europe, they carried with them not just soldiers but lawyers and accountants, prefects and tax registrars. In the territories they occupied, Germany, Italy, Spain, the Low Countries, they installed French-style administration, swept away feudal privileges, and established the principle of universal, bureaucratically managed taxation. Much of this survived Napoleon's defeat. The modern administrative state of continental Europe, with its census records, land registries, and professional civil service, owes more to Napoleon's fiscal ambitions than to any philosophical tradition. The Industrial Revolution created new forms of wealth on a scale that existing tax systems had not been designed to reach. forcing governments to rethink what they taxed and why. The landowner who drew income from agricultural rents had been the central figure of England's tax system for centuries. He paid the land tax. He sat in Parliament and made sure the land tax stayed moderate. The merchant who traded goods paid customs and excise. These categories had organised English fiscal life since before anyone living could remember. But the Industrial Revolution created something new. The manufacturer who drew income not from land or trade but from production, from the machines in his mill, from the labour of his workers, from the capital he had invested in buildings and equipment and steam power. This new industrial wealth was, for a time, barely taxed at all. Income taxes, where they existed, fell on the propertied classes in ways that industrial profits could often escape. The workers in the mills paid their share through excise taxes on consumer goods, on the bread and beer and tobacco that made their hard lives slightly more bearable. The mill owners, accumulating fortunes on a scale previously available only to the great aristocratic families, often paid less. This asymmetry became a defining political grievance of the 19th century, feeding the reform movements that eventually reshaped the tax codes of industrialized nations. What the Industrial Revolution also created was the conceptual raw material for progressive income taxation. If wealth could be generated not by ancient inheritance, but by industrial activity, then the old arguments for light taxation of property no longer applied in the same way. New money was not old money. The Manchester manufacturer who had built his fortune in a generation seemed, to reformers, like a different kind of taxpayer than the Duke who had held the same land for 10 generations. Whether that difference justified different treatment was argued in parliaments and pamphlets for most of the 19th century. The answer eventually was yes. The American Civil War produced the first federal income tax in United States history, born of the same fiscal desperation that had produced Britain's income tax 60 years earlier. When the southern states seceded and war began in 1861, the federal government faced a financial emergency that dwarfed anything in its peacetime experience. The Union Army had to be equipped, fed, paid, and expanded from a small frontier constabulary into the largest military force North America had ever seen. The existing revenue, primarily customs duties, was nowhere near sufficient. Congress turned to measures it had avoided for decades: a new income tax, excise taxes on a bewildering range of goods, and a novel innovation called the greenback, paper money issued by the federal government and backed not by gold but by the full faith and credit of the Union. The Revenue Act of 1861 imposed a flat tax of 3% on annual incomes above $800. It was amended in 1862 to create a graduated structure: 3% on incomes from $600 to $10,000, 5% above that. These were modest rates by the standards of what came later, but the principle they established was significant. The federal government could look into a citizen's finances, assess what they earned, and claim a portion of it. The machinery of assessment and collection was built from scratch, staffed by a new Commissioner of Internal Revenue and a small army of assessors and collectors spread across the loyal states. When the war ended and the emergency passed, the income tax was repealed in 1872. It returned briefly in 1894, attached to a tariff bill, and was promptly struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional, a direct tax not apportioned among the states. It took a constitutional amendment, the 16th, ratified in 1913, to permanently settle the question. By then, the progressive movement was ascendant. The gap between the very rich and the vast middle was a live political issue, and the case for a permanent federal income tax had been made in 1,000 speeches and editorials. The 16th Amendment passed. The federal income tax returned, and this time stayed. The introduction of graduated income tax rates in the late 19th and early 20th centuries reflected a new theory of fiscal justice, that the state's claim on citizens' resources should rise with their ability to pay. The classical economists had debated the fairest basis for taxation for a century before any government actually implemented a graduated income tax. Adam Smith, in The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, had listed proportionality as a principle of fair taxation, that people should contribute in proportion to their means. John Stuart Mill, writing in the mid-19th century, went further, arguing that taxes should be based on the equality of sacrifice, that taking a pound from a rich man imposed less real sacrifice than taking a pound from a poor one. and that therefore a just tax system would take a larger percentage from higher incomes. This is the philosophical foundation of progressive taxation, stated with elegant simplicity. 10% of £100 means far more to the person who has only 100 than to the person who has 1,000. Politicians were slower to act than philosophers had argued. The resistance of the wealthy to income taxes, particularly graduated ones, was as energetic as it was predictable. Arguments against progression ranged from the principled it punished success, discouraged investment, violated property rights, to the paranoid it was socialism, it was tyranny, it was the first step toward communism. In the United States, the debate about whether a graduated income tax was even constitutional occupied courts and constitutional scholars for decades. What ultimately forced the issue, more than any philosophical argument, was fiscal reality. The industrialized nations of the early 20th century were discovering that the functions expected of modern government, universal education, old age pensions, public health, military preparedness, cost far more than any system of flat taxes or customs duties could reliably generate. If governments were going to do more, they needed more money. And the only places where substantially more money could be found were the large incomes and accumulated fortunes of the economically successful. Progression was not just a matter of justice, it was, increasingly, a matter of arithmetic. The First World War subjected the fiscal systems of every major belligerent nation to pressures they had never experienced, transforming taxation from a peacetime administrative matter into an emergency instrument of total war. When the war began in August 1914, every government assumed it would be short, weeks perhaps, months at most. The fiscal arrangements made in those first weeks reflected that assumption. Emergency borrowing, modest tax increases, appeals to patriotic sacrifice. By 1915, it was clear that no one had been right about the duration, and by 1916 the scale of expenditure had grown so enormous that no peacetime framework of finance could contain it. Britain, France, Germany, and eventually the United States were spending in a month what they had once spent in a year. Income tax rates rose with a speed that would have seemed fantastic before the war. Britain's income tax, which stood at 6% at the war's outbreak, had reached 25% on ordinary incomes by 1918, and much more on larger ones. A surtax on high incomes brought the effective rate on very large incomes to over 80%. These were numbers that no one in the pro-war debate about progressive taxation had seriously proposed. War made them not just possible but necessary, and it made them politically feasible in ways that peacetime politics had not allowed, because war demanded visible sacrifice from everyone and made the question of who was contributing and how much a matter of public morality rather than just economics. The war also accelerated the administrative development of income taxation in the United States. The Revenue Acts of 1916 and 1917 dramatically raised rates and broadened the base of taxpayers, and the War Revenue Act of 1918 introduced an excess profits tax, a levy on corporate profits that exceeded a pro-war baseline, designed to prevent profiteering from the suffering of others. These measures raised federal revenues to levels that would have been unimaginable before the war. They also established the institutional infrastructure, the trained staff, the procedures, the regulations that the income tax would need to become a permanent feature of American financial life. The interwar period revealed how deeply tax policy was intertwined with economic ideology, as countries swung between fiscal contraction and fiscal expansion in response to depression and political crisis. The 1920s in America were a decade of deliberate tax reduction. Andrew Mellon, Secretary of the Treasury under 3 successive Republican presidents, pursued a single-minded agenda of cutting the top income tax rate, which had reached 73% at the war's peak, down toward the 25% he believed was optimal. His argument was the ancestor of supply-side theory. Lower rates on high incomes would encourage investment, stimulate growth, and ultimately generate more revenue, not less, as a larger economy produced more taxable activity. Taxes on inherited wealth, the estate tax, were also cut. The wealthy did well in the 1920s, and they paid less in taxes than they had at the war's end. The depression that followed the 1929 crash created a fiscal dilemma that defied easy resolution. Tax revenues collapsed as incomes fell and businesses failed. Government spending on relief was needed as unemployment rose toward 25%. Herbert Hoover's instinct, and the orthodox economic view was that the government should balance its budget even in hard times, which meant raising taxes as revenues fell. The Revenue Act of 1932, passed at the depth of the Depression, raised the top income tax rate from 25 back to 63%. It may have been one of the worst fiscal decisions in American history, deepening the Depression precisely when stimulus was needed. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal reversed course, expanding spending while also raising taxes on high incomes and corporations. The top rate reached 79% by 1936 and 94% during the Second World War. These rates reflected both the revenue needs of a government fighting a world war and a genuine political philosophy, that extreme concentrations of wealth were dangerous to democracy, and that the tax system was an appropriate instrument for limiting them. Whether that philosophy was right is a debate that has never fully ended. The Second World War transformed income taxation from a tax on the prosperous few into a mass tax that touched the lives of ordinary working families for the first time. Before the war, the federal income tax in the United States was paid by a relatively small fraction of the population, those with incomes above a meaningful threshold. The overwhelming majority of working Americans simply did not earn enough to be within its reach. The war changed this almost overnight. The Revenue Act of 1942, described by Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau as a tax bill to win the war, dramatically lowered exemptions and extended the taxes reached downward into the incomes of factory workers, clerks and laborers who had never previously filed a return. To manage the resulting administrative challenge, tens of millions of new taxpayers, each requiring an annual reckoning with the tax authorities, the government introduced withholding in 1943. Instead of requiring taxpayers to calculate and remit their taxes at the end of the year, employers would now deduct tax from each paycheck and remit it directly to the government. The taxpayer's annual return became, for most people, a reconciliation of what had already been withheld rather than a payment of what was freshly owed. Withholding made compliance dramatically easier and dramatically harder to evade, since the tax was removed before the money ever reached the worker's hand. This mass income tax, once established, proved impossible to reverse. The revenue it generated funded not just wartime expenditure, but the peacetime expansion of government that followed. Veterans' benefits, the interstate highway system, the Cold War military buildup, the early architecture of the welfare state, all of these were financed in significant part by a federal income tax that reached into the paychecks of nearly every employed American. The mass income tax was not the plan, it was the emergency, but emergencies have a way of becoming permanent when they work. The post-war welfare state in Western Europe represented the most ambitious attempt in history to use taxation as an instrument of social reconstruction, building universal systems of healthcare, education, and retirement security from the ruins of war. Britain's Labour government, elected in a landslide in July 1945, faced a country physically damaged, financially exhausted, and politically transformed by the experience of total war. The Beveridge Report of 1942, which had proposed a comprehensive system of social insurance covering citizens from the cradle to the grave, had been read with hungry attention by millions of people who had survived the Depression and the Blitz, and were determined that the peace would be different from what had come before. The National Health Service, National Insurance, Council Housing, full employment policy, these were not modest ambitions. They required correspondingly immodest revenues. The post-war decades in Britain, France, Germany, Scandinavia, and the other Western democracies were marked by high marginal tax rates on high incomes. In Britain, the top rate reached 98% on investment income in the 1970s, combined with extensive social provision for ordinary citizens. This bargain was, in political terms, broadly stable for a generation. The wealthy paid very high marginal rates. The working population received services, free healthcare, free education, pension security, that their parents had not had. Unions were strong. Full employment was a policy goal, not merely an aspiration. The economics of this arrangement were more complicated than either its defenders or its critics allowed. High marginal rates on paper often coexisted with effective rates considerably lower, as the wealthy found legal ways to minimize their exposure. The social provision was genuinely valuable. European life expectancy, infant mortality, and educational attainment improved dramatically through this period. The question of whether the high marginal rates caused economic harm or whether the social provision generated economic benefit was contested then and remains contested now, though the historical record suggests the post-war economy was considerably more robust than theories of tax-driven disincentive would have predicted. The concept of the tax haven, a jurisdiction that attracts foreign capital by offering low or zero tax rates and strict secrecy, became a defining feature of global finance in the second half of the 20th century. Switzerland had been protecting the financial secrets of foreign depositors since the 19th century, but the legal codification of bank secrecy in the Swiss Banking Act of 1934 gave its privacy protections constitutional weight. The political context was Europe on the verge of catastrophe. Wealthy Germans and others were indeed moving money to Switzerland to protect it from seizure by increasingly radical governments. But the Swiss law made no distinction between a Jewish industrialist fleeing Nazi confiscation and a French businessman hiding profits from the taxman. The numbered account, known without a name, became a byword for a certain kind of discrete financial arrangement. What happened after the Second World War was the systematic development of this idea into an industry. Tiny jurisdictions that had little economic activity of their own, the Cayman Islands, Jersey, Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, later Bermuda, the British Virgin Islands, and dozens more, discovered that they could attract enormous flows of capital simply by making themselves convenient for money that did not want to be seen. They charged low or no taxes on offshore profits. They maintained strict secrecy. They developed sophisticated legal structures, holding companies, trusts, foundations that allowed money to technically reside in one place while its beneficial owner remained, legally speaking, elsewhere. By the end of the 20th century, estimates suggested that somewhere between $10 and $30 trillion in private wealth was held in offshore accounts and structures. The tax revenue foregone was enormous enough, critics argued, to fund the social programs that governments in high-tax countries were cutting for lack of funds. The offshore system had created a two-tiered fiscal world, one in which ordinary wage earners, whose income was reported by their employers and visible to tax authorities, paid their full statutory rates, and one in which the very wealthy, whose income flowed through complex structures across multiple jurisdictions, paid what their advisors could negotiate. This asymmetry became, over time, one of the defining political grievances of the early 21st century. The Reagan and Thatcher revolutions of the 1980s represented the most significant political and philosophical reorientation of tax policy since the Progressive era, arguing that lower taxes on wealth and high incomes would produce broadly shared prosperity. Ronald Reagan entered the White House in January 1981 with a clear fiscal agenda: cut income tax rates, cut capital gains taxes, reduce the burden of government on private economic activity, and trust that the resulting growth would more than compensate for any lost revenue. His Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981 cut the top marginal rate on ordinary income from 70% to 50%, and further reforms in 1986 brought it to 28%, lower than at any time since before the New Deal. The theory underlying these cuts, that reducing tax rates on high incomes would stimulate investment, that the benefits would flow downward through the economy, was called supply-side economics by its proponents and trickle-down economics by its critics. Margaret Thatcher pursued a parallel agenda in Britain, cutting the top income tax rate from 83% to 60% in her first budget in 1979, and eventually to 40%. Both leaders argued that the high marginal rates of the post-war decades had been economically counterproductive, driving capital offshore, discouraging enterprise, and producing a fiscal illusion, high rates that generated less actual revenue than lower rates would have, because the very wealthy had so many ways to avoid them. The debate about what actually happened in the 1980s has never been fully resolved, partly because the evidence is genuinely complicated, and partly because so much ideological investment on both sides distorts its reading. What seems clear is that economic growth in the Reagan-Thatcher years was real, but so was the growth in inequality. Incomes at the top grew dramatically. Incomes in the middle grew modestly. Incomes at the bottom in some measures fell. The gap between the wealthiest Americans and everyone else, which had been relatively stable or declining since the Second World War, began the upward trend that has continued ever since. Whether tax policy caused this or merely failed to prevent it or had nothing to do with it. That argument continues in economics departments and on editorial pages around the world. Value-added tax, a levy on the value added at each stage of production and distribution, became the dominant form of consumption tax across most of the developed world in the late 20th century, adopted by over 160 countries. The value-added tax, or VAT, was the invention of a French tax inspector named Maurice Laurey, who proposed it in the 1950s as a more efficient and less distorting alternative to the cascade taxes, then common in France and elsewhere. A cascade tax, applied each time a good changes hands, created incentives for businesses to vertically integrate in order to avoid the tax, and it applied tax on top of tax in ways that made the final burden difficult to calculate. Laurey's insight was that if each business in the chain paid tax only on the value it added, remitted the difference between the tax on its sales and the tax on its purchases, and received a credit for taxes already paid, the result would be a clean, self-reporting system that covered all stages of production without double counting. France introduced VAT in 1954, initially only for manufacturers. The European Economic Community, which would become the European Union, adopted VAT as the standard consumption tax for all its members in 1967, and as the EEC grew, VAT spread. By the end of the 20th century, it had been adopted in virtually every major economy except the United States, which retained its patchwork of state sales taxes instead. The United States case was instructive. VAT faced sustained political opposition as a potential money machine that would make it too easy for government to raise revenue invisibly. 1 percentage point at a time. VAT's great virtue, from the perspective of fiscal administrators, is its self-enforcing quality. Each business in the chain has an incentive to obtain receipts from its suppliers, because those receipts are the basis for the tax credit it will claim. The paper trail is built into the mechanics of the system. This makes VAT harder to evade than many other taxes. It is also, critics note, inherently regressive. It takes the same percentage from every purchase, which represents a larger share of the income of the poor than of the wealthy. Most VAT systems attempt to address this by exempting necessities like food and medicine, but the fundamental regressivity is only partially offset. Corporate taxation became a contested terrain in the late 20th century, as multinational companies developed sophisticated strategies to shift profits from high tax to low tax jurisdictions without moving a single employee. The problem was structural. Companies that operated in multiple countries earned income in one place, incurred costs in another, held intellectual property in a third, and financed their operations through a fourth. Tax law, written in the era of the nation-state, assumed that profit could be matched to a jurisdiction where it was earned. But a company that manufactured in Ireland, sold across Europe, licensed its technology from a subsidiary in Luxembourg, and borrowed from an affiliate in the Netherlands, was generating profits that could be reported almost anywhere its tax advisors chose. Transfer pricing, the prices that subsidiaries charge each other for goods, services, and intellectual property, offered almost unlimited flexibility to shift reported profits toward low-tax locations. Google, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, and dozens of other digital companies became symbols of this problem in the early 21st century. They employed millions of customers and sold billions of dollars in advertising and goods in high-tax European countries, then reported their profits through Irish and Dutch structures, arrangements with names like the Double Irish and the Dutch Sandwich, that effectively moved the taxable income to near-zero tax jurisdictions like Bermuda. These structures were legal. They operated in the spaces between national tax systems that had never been designed with truly global companies in mind. The political anger this generated was significant. In the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, when governments were cutting services and raising taxes on ordinary citizens to reduce deficits, the spectacle of profitable corporations paying effective tax rates of 2 or 3% struck many people as a form of free riding that the system was unable or unwilling to address. Parliamentary hearings in Britain, Senate investigations in the United States, and the European Commission's state aid cases against Apple's Irish arrangements all testified to the political urgency of the problem, even as the legal solutions remained elusive. The 2008 financial crisis forced a fundamental reckoning with the relationship between taxation, financial regulation, and inequality, revealing how much the fiscal architecture of the developed world had been quietly reshaped by the preceding decades. When the global financial system came to the edge of collapse in September and October of 2008, governments responded with bailouts of a scale that would have seemed fantastical a year before. The United States committed hundreds of billions of dollars to stabilize banks that were, in the memorable phrase of the time, too big to fail. The United Kingdom nationalized banks. European governments guaranteed deposits and purchased equity stakes in financial institutions. The alternative, allowing the system to collapse, was understood by most economists as too catastrophic to contemplate. The fiscal consequences were profound and lasting. Governments that had borrowed to fund the bailouts and then borrowed again to fund the stimulus spending that cushioned the recession found themselves with debt levels that had been unimaginable in peacetime. The austerity policies that followed in Britain, the Eurozone periphery, and elsewhere attempted to reduce those debts through a combination of spending cuts and tax increases. The spending cuts fell hardest on public services that lower-income citizens depended on. The tax increases were broad-based, VAT increases, freeze on personal allowances, rather than targeted at those who had benefited most from the financial system's excesses. The sense that the costs of the crisis had been socialized, while the gains of the preceding decade had been privatized, fed a political anger that did not quickly dissipate. It became one of the drivers of the populist politics that reshaped electoral maps across the Western world in the years that followed. The fiscal settlement, who pays, and for what, and in exchange for what was being challenged in ways that the political mainstream was slow to recognize and slower still to address. The rise of the gig economy and platform work in the 21st century exposed fundamental gaps in tax systems designed for a world where workers were employees and income came in regular paychecks. The standard model of employment, a worker, an employer, a paycheck withholding, a W-2 or a P-60, had been the backbone of mass income taxation since the Second World War. It worked because the three-way relationship between worker, employer, and tax authority was clearly defined and legally enforced. The employer knew who the worker was. The employer knew what the worker was paid. The employer withheld the tax and remitted it. The workers' contribution to the public finances happened largely without their active participation. Platform work disrupted this model systematically. An Uber driver, a TaskRabbit handyman, an Airbnb host, a freelance writer on Upwork. All of these workers received income from multiple sources, none of which had the legal obligations of an employer. They were classified usually as independent contractors, which meant they were responsible for their own tax payments, their own self-employment taxes, their own quarterly estimated payments. They received a 1099 form rather than a W-2, or in some countries no formal documentation at all. For people accustomed to the relative simplicity of wage employment, this was disorienting. For tax authorities accustomed to collecting income at source, it was a compliance challenge of growing magnitude. The broader question of whether gig workers were really independent contractors or were effectively employees denied the legal protections and tax treatment that employment would bring, was fought out in courtrooms and legislatures across multiple countries. California's Proposition 22, which exempted gig companies from a law that would have classified their workers as employees, was both a legal landmark and a demonstration of how much political and financial power the platforms had accumulated. The fiscal implications of getting this classification wrong, or right, were substantial, touching not just income tax but payroll taxes, retirement contributions, and the funding base of social insurance systems designed when the standard employment relationship was the overwhelming norm. The global minimum corporate tax agreement, reached in 2021, represented the most significant multilateral reform of international tax rules in decades, attempting to set a floor below which corporate tax rates could not effectively fall. The agreement, negotiated through the OECD under the umbrella of the G20, involved 136 countries committing to a minimum effective corporate tax rate of 15%. The principle was straightforward. If a multinational company reported profits in a jurisdiction that taxed them at less than 15%, the company's home country could impose a top-up tax to bring the effective rate to the minimum. The profit-shifting strategies that had allowed some companies to pay effective rates of 2 or 3% would, at least in theory, lose most of their value. What was the point of routing profits through Bermuda if the home country would simply collect the difference anyway? The political journey to this agreement had been long and contested. The United States, under the Obama administration, had proposed variants of global minimum taxation that went nowhere. The Trump administration withdrew American support from multilateral tax cooperation and cut the U.S. corporate rate from 35% to 21% in 2017. The Biden administration reversed course, championing the global minimum as both a fairness measure and a way to make U.S. companies more competitive with foreign rivals who had been using offshore structures to reduce their tax burdens. The agreement was historic in its ambition, and its ultimate effectiveness remains to be fully measured. Implementation across 136 jurisdictions with different legal systems, different political pressures, and different vested interests is genuinely complex. Small tax havens argued that the minimum rate would strip them of their primary economic activity. Large economies debated the details of implementation and carve-outs. But the direction was clear. The era in which globalization had effectively placed multinationals above the reach of national tax systems was, at least partially, coming to an end. The debate over wealth taxes in the early 21st century revived an ancient question about whether the state has the right and the capacity to tax not just what people earn but what they own. Annual wealth taxes, levies assessed each year on the total value of a person's assets above a given threshold, had existed in several European countries, including Sweden, France, Germany, and Switzerland, at various points in the post-war decades. Most of them had been repealed or drastically scaled back by the early 2000s, victims of administrative complexity, capital flight, and the political resistance of the wealthy. France's ISF, the Solidarity Tax on Wealth, was abolished by President Macron in 2017, replaced with a narrower levy on real estate holdings, on the grounds that it was driving wealthy French citizens to other countries. Yet the wealth tax idea returned with new energy in the late 2010s and early 2020s, championed by politicians like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders in the United States and various progressive parties in Europe. The revival was driven by data. Studies by economists including Thomas Piketty, Emmanuel Sees, and Gabriel Zuckman had documented a striking and accelerating concentration of wealth at the very top of the distribution, suggesting that income taxes alone, which taxed what people earned each year, were inadequate tools for addressing inequalities that had been accumulating over decades and generations. A person who owned $10 billion in stock might have a modest reportable income in any given year if they did not sell their shares, while living on borrowed money at low interest rates. Their income tax liability might be trivially small. Their wealth and the economic and political power it represented was nonetheless enormous. Whether wealth taxes are administratively feasible in the 21st century remains genuinely contested. The valuation of closely held businesses, private equity stakes, and unique assets like art and real estate is technically difficult and legally contentious. The risk of capital flight, of the very wealthy moving themselves or their assets to more hospitable jurisdictions, is real, though studies of past wealth tax regimes suggest it may be smaller than its proponents argue. What is not contested is the political salience of the question. How to tax wealth, whether to tax it at all, is one of the central fiscal arguments of our time. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 and 2021 tested fiscal systems as severely as any event since the Second World War, requiring governments to deploy revenue and borrowing on an emergency scale, while simultaneously confronting questions of who bore the virus's costs and who bore the costs of the response. Governments that had spent years arguing about whether they could afford small expansions of the welfare state suddenly found themselves spending 10 or 20 or 30% of GDP in emergency support, furlough schemes, business loans, direct payments to households, healthcare procurement. The intellectual arguments against emergency fiscal expansion, that markets would panic, that interest rates would spike, that debt sustainability was at risk, largely failed to materialize. Interest rates stayed low, in some cases negative. Central banks bought government bonds on a vast scale. The experience suggested that the constraints on fiscal policy in a crisis were less tight than austerity orthodoxy had implied. The pandemic also revealed and amplified inequalities in ways that had immediate fiscal relevance. Workers in sectors that could operate remotely, knowledge workers, professionals, financial services, often maintained or increased their incomes through the crisis. Workers in sectors that could not operate remotely, hospitality, retail, personal care, transport, faced unemployment or health risk. These patterns mapped closely onto existing income distributions, with the result that the pandemic made the already unequal distribution of economic outcomes more unequal still. The fiscal response attempted to offset some of this divergence, but the mechanisms of relief were imperfect, and the longer-term distributional effects of the debt accumulated to fund the response remained a live political question. Tax policy in the pandemic's aftermath reflected the unresolved tensions of the era. Some countries introduced temporary levies on excess profits in sectors that had benefited pharmaceuticals, energy companies in the period of spiking fuel prices, while others cut taxes to stimulate recovery. The United States passed a significant expansion of child tax credits that temporarily reduced child poverty with striking effectiveness, then allowed it to lapse. The European Union distributed recovery, funds conditional on structural reforms. Every response was shaped by the particular political economy of each jurisdiction, and no two were quite alike. Otto von Bismarck invented the modern welfare state not out of progressive idealism, but as a calculated strategy to undercut the appeal of socialism and bind the German working class to the imperial government. In the 1880s, the newly unified German Empire under Chancellor Bismarck faced a political threat that he took very seriously. The Social Democratic Party was gaining strength among the industrial working class, offering a vision of a society that distributed wealth radically differently from the one Bismarck's conservative coalition had built. Bismarck's response was a masterstroke of political cunning. He would give the workers something tangible, security against sickness, accident and old age, and he would do it through the state, making the imperial government the provider of benefits that the socialists had promised. The insurance laws of 1883, 1884, and 1889 created compulsory health insurance, accident insurance, and old age pensions for German industrial workers. It was the first time any government had created a comprehensive system of social insurance, funded by compulsory contributions from both workers and employers. The fiscal mechanism Bismarck chose was the payroll tax, a levy on wages, split between worker and employer, dedicated specifically to the insurance funds rather than flowing into general revenues. This earmarking was deliberate. It created a visible and direct link between contribution and benefit, making the insurance feel less like a gift from the state and more like a right earned through work. Workers who paid into the system felt they owned something. The connection between contribution and entitlement became one of the most psychologically powerful features of social insurance systems, and it has shaped the politics of welfare spending in every country that adopted the German model. To cut old age pensions is not merely to reduce government spending, it is to take away something people have paid for, and the political consequences of that framing have proved durable across a century and a half. The Bismarckian model spread across Europe and eventually the world, shaping not just social policy but the structure of taxation itself. The payroll tax, whether called social security contributions, national insurance or pension levies, became in most developed countries one of the largest sources of government revenue, rivaling income taxes in scale. It also became, over time, one of the more controversial. A flat-rate levy on wages up to a ceiling, it is effectively regressive, taking the same percentage from a factory worker as from a middle manager, and nothing at all from incomes above the cap. The social insurance it funds is popular. The mechanism that funds it is, when examined closely, less obviously fair than it first appears. The inheritance tax, a levy on the transfer of wealth at death, has been debated for millennia as both a fiscal instrument and a philosophical statement about what the state owes to equality and what families owe to their children. Ancient Rome imposed a 5% tax on inheritances, the vicesima hereditatium, to fund the military treasury. Augustus introduced it in 6 CE, exempting close relatives and the poor but applying it broadly enough to generate significant revenue. The Romans justified it in part on the grounds that the legions that protected property and trade were the reason that property could be accumulated in the first place. Those who benefited most from that protection, the wealthy, owed a contribution when passing their wealth on. This logic, that accumulated wealth depends in part on the social conditions the state maintains, would recur across centuries of debate about estate taxation. The modern inheritance tax in its American form traces to 1916, introduced partly to fund preparation for a possible entry into the European war and partly as an expression of the progressive movement's suspicion of inherited wealth. Theodore Roosevelt had articulated the case with characteristic force. A large inherited fortune, he argued, was not merely a private matter, but a threat to democratic equality. A society in which some families could perpetuate vast advantages across generations, regardless of the merit of the inheritors, was not the meritocratic republic the American founding had promised. The estate tax was, in this framing, a civic corrective, not confiscation but a rebalancing, a mechanism to ensure that each generation had to justify its position rather than simply inheriting it. The counterargument was equally old and equally sincere. Families that had built wealth through productive activity ought to be able to pass it to their children. The state had no more right to interrupt that transfer than to confiscate a house or a business. Moreover, inheritance taxes forced the sale of farms and family businesses whose value was illiquid. A farmer whose land was worth $2 million might not have the cash to pay an estate tax on it. These concerns shaped American estate tax law, which developed elaborate exemptions and deferral provisions. They also shaped the political rhetoric of estate tax opponents, who dubbed it the death tax, a phrase designed to evoke the visceral unfairness of losing something cherished at a moment of grief. The rebranding worked, politically speaking, more effectively than any economic argument. Americans who would never pay $1 of estate tax came to oppose it on behalf of the wealthy strangers who would. Gandhi's Salt March of 1930 transformed a tax protest into one of the most powerful acts of political theatre in history, demonstrating that fiscal grievance, when given the right symbolic frame, could move millions. The British colonial government's salt monopoly in India prohibited Indians from producing or selling salt independently, requiring them to purchase it from government-licensed merchants at prices that included a salt tax. This was not, in absolute terms, a crushing burden, but its symbolic weight was enormous. Salt was the most basic of necessities, produced by the sun and the sea in a country that had more of both than it knew what to do with. That the colonial government should prohibit Indians from simply picking it up from a beach, and should imprison them if they did, seemed to crystallize, in the clearest possible terms, the nature of colonial rule. Gandhi understood the political power of this symbol with extraordinary precision. On March 12, 1930, he set out from his ashram in Ahmedabad on a 241-mile walk to the coastal village of Dandi, followed by a growing number of followers. When he reached the sea on April 6, he stooped and picked up a handful of salt. The act was illegal. He intended it to be. Across India, thousands of people went to their local beaches and salt flats, and did the same. The British arrested Gandhi, and eventually, more than 60,000 people. They filled the jails with Indians who had committed the crime of picking salt from the ground of their own country. The world watched, and what it saw changed the politics of empire. The image of disciplined, non-violent protesters being beaten by police for possessing a handful of sea salt was not one that could be reconciled with the civilizing mission that colonial rule claimed for itself. The Salt March did not immediately end British rule in India, that took another 17 years and a world war. But it demonstrated something about the political power of fiscal protest that had been obscured since the Boston Tea Party. The right tax, protested in the right way, could become an argument about human dignity that no force of arms could simply suppress. Proposition 13 in California, passed by voters in 1978, was the opening shot of a property tax revolt that reshaped American fiscal politics and exported an anti-tax ideology that would influence governments around the world. By the late 1970s, California property values had risen dramatically, and property tax assessments had risen with them. Elderly homeowners who had bought their houses decades earlier found their tax bills doubling and tripling as the market value of their homes increased, value they had not realized in cash and could not easily access. Many faced the prospect of being taxed out of homes they had lived in for 30 or 40 years. Howard Jarvis, a cantankerous 75-year-old businessman, and Paul Gann organized a ballot initiative to cap property taxes at 1% of assessed value and limit assessment increases to 2% per year unless a property changed hands. The initiative passed with nearly 2/3 of the vote. It was an expression of genuine popular grievance. Many of the people who voted for it were exactly the elderly homeowners whose situation Jarvis had described. but its effects extended far beyond the protection of fixed-income seniors. By severely limiting property tax revenues, Proposition 13 forced California to shift funding for schools and local services towards state government, away from local control. It created a system in which identical houses on the same street could be assessed at wildly different values, depending on when they were purchased, a structural inequity that persisted for decades. And by demonstrating that voters would support dramatic tax limitations even in a liberal state, it emboldened similar movements across the country and gave intellectual legitimacy to the proposition that tax limitation itself, not just tax reform, was a legitimate political goal. The political scientist Hugh Hecklow described what followed as the delegitimation of government, a sustained political effort to frame taxation not as a civic contribution, but as a form of governmental aggression against which citizens were entitled to protect themselves. This framing, amplified by think tanks, talk radio, and eventually the internet, became one of the defining currents of American political life in the last decades of the 20th century. It was not invented by Proposition 13, but Proposition 13 proved that it could win, and winning changes everything. The Scandinavian model of high taxation combined with expansive public services challenged the conventional assumption that high tax rates necessarily produced lower growth, offering a different vision of what a fiscal bargain between state and citizen could look like. Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Finland built over the course of the 20th century welfare states of unusual generosity and scope. They offered universal healthcare, heavily subsidized childcare and elder care, free university education, generous unemployment insurance, and old age pensions that ensured a comfortable retirement for virtually all citizens. They funded these services with tax burdens that ranked among the highest in the world, total tax revenues as a percentage of GDP approaching or exceeding 50% in some years. By the logic of supply-side economics, this should have crushed economic dynamism. In practice, the Nordic economies were consistently among the most competitive, innovative, and productive in the world. The puzzle of Scandinavian success has been analysed extensively, with various explanations offered: high levels of social trust that made compliance easier, a political culture that perceived taxes as a fair exchange rather than a state confiscation, labour market institutions that maintained high employment even with strong safety nets, educational systems that produced highly skilled workers. All of these factors were real, and none of them individually explained the full picture. What the Nordic experience suggested at minimum was that the relationship between tax rates and economic performance was not as simple as the strongest critics of progressive taxation implied. High taxes, under the right institutional conditions, could coexist with high prosperity. What often went unremarked in international comparisons of the Nordic model was the design of the taxes themselves. Scandinavian countries did not fund their welfare states primarily through very high top marginal income tax rates on the wealthy. They funded them through broad-based consumption taxes, VAT rates of 25% that applied to everyone, and through relatively modest income taxes that fell more heavily on the middle class than comparable countries. The welfare state was, in this sense, something the entire population was paying for, not something the wealthy were subsidizing for the poor. That fiscal structure had political implications for the sustainability of public support. When everyone contributes, everyone has a stake. The philosophical distinction between tax avoidance and tax evasion, one legal, one criminal, has defined and troubled the ethics of taxation for as long as complex tax systems have existed. Tax evasion is the illegal concealment of income or assets from tax authorities, not reporting cash income, hiding money in undisclosed foreign accounts, claiming deductions for expenses that never occurred. It is fraud, and its legal consequences in most jurisdictions include criminal penalties. Tax avoidance, by contrast, is the legal arrangement of one's affairs to minimize tax liability. It involves taking legitimate deductions, using legal structures, and exploiting provisions of the tax code that are available to anyone who qualifies. It is, in the strict legal sense, entirely permissible. The problem is that the line between the two has always been contested and context-dependent. When a wealthy family sets up a charitable foundation, claims tax deductions for contributions, and uses the foundation's resources to fund causes they would have pursued privately anyway, is that avoidance or something more troubling? when a corporation creates a subsidiary in a low-tax jurisdiction, primarily for the purpose of having profits appear to arise there, it is within the letter of the law in most countries. Whether it is within the spirit of the law, whether it represents the kind of tax-paying behavior that a functioning society requires, is a different question. The Judge Learned Hand famously wrote that there is nothing sinister in so arranging one's affairs as to keep taxes as low as possible. The economist John Maynard Keynes, watching the same era from a different angle, suggested that the avoidance of taxes was the only intellectual pursuit that still carries any reward. What neither Hand nor Keynes could fully anticipate was the industrialization of avoidance, the rise of an entire professional industry devoted to finding and exploiting the spaces in tax codes on behalf of those who could afford to pay for the expertise. Law firms, accounting firms, specialized boutiques, and offshore service providers have built substantial practices around the engineering of tax-minimizing structures. The cost of this expertise, which can run to hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in professional fees, means that it is available primarily to large corporations and very wealthy individuals. The result is a two-tier system, not of legal versus illegal behavior, but of sophisticated optimization available to the few and simple compliance required of the many. The Laffer curve, the proposition that there exists an optimal tax rate beyond which higher rates actually reduce revenue, became one of the most influential and contested ideas in the fiscal politics of the late 20th century. The intellectual history of the idea is older than Arthur Laffer, the economist who gave it his name. Jonathan Swift had made a version of the argument in the 18th century. The 19th century French economist Frédéric Bastiat had noted that zero tax and 100% tax would both yield zero revenue, with the implication that an intermediate optimum existed. What Laffer added, according to the famous story, drawing the curve on a napkin at a restaurant in Washington in 1974 for Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, was a presentation so simple and visual that it became a rallying symbol for supply-side tax cutting. The Laffer curve is correct in a trivial sense. There is obviously some rate above which further increases reduce the behavioral incentives that generate the income being taxed. If the tax rate reaches 100%, no rational actor will report taxable income, and the government will collect nothing. The contested question is not whether the curve exists, but where the peak is. At what rate does additional taxation begin to reduce rather than increase revenue? And the even more contested question is whether, in any given historical circumstance, tax rates were actually on the wrong side of that peak. Supply-side proponents in the 1980s argued that American and British top rates of 70 or 80% were clearly on the downward slope, that cutting them would increase revenue by unleashing economic activity. The evidence after the Reagan and Thatcher cuts was ambiguous. Revenue did not increase as share of GDP in the ways that the strongest supply-side predictions had implied. Deficits in the United States grew substantially in the Reagan years. But the cuts were followed by economic growth that was real, if unevenly distributed. The debate about what caused what, tax cuts, Paul Volcker's monetary policy, falling oil prices, global trends, proved impossible to resolve to general satisfaction. The Laffer curve survived as a political argument long after the empirical questions had rendered it contestable, because simple and visual ideas have staying power that complicated empirical debates do not. The practice of tax farming, outsourcing the collection of taxes to private contractors who paid the government up front and kept the surplus, illuminates how fiscal systems can concentrate extraction in the hands of those who are least accountable to those they extract from. Tax farming was ancient. It appeared in the Athenian agora in the Persian Empire in Rome and in nearly every other complex state of the ancient world. The logic was simple. Governments often lacked the administrative capacity to collect taxes directly. The census had not been conducted recently. The roads were bad. The records were imperfect. A private contractor who knew the local terrain and had his own enforcement capacity could collect more than the state could, or at least collect it faster. In exchange, he paid the state a fixed sum up front and was entitled to keep whatever he extracted beyond that sum. His profit was the spread between what he promised the state and what he could wring from the population. In France before the Revolution, tax farming had grown into one of the most elaborate financial institutions in Europe. The firm Gainerail, the General Farm, was a consortium of wealthy financiers who collectively contracted with the Crown to collect indirect taxes. customs, salt taxes, excise duties. They employed tens of thousands of agents, maintained networks of warehouses and inspection posts, and extracted revenues on a massive scale. The farmers general, the men at the top of this consortium, were among the richest people in France, their fortunes built on the margin between what they paid the crown and what they collected from the population. Antoine Lavoisier, one of the founders of modern chemistry, was a farmer general. He was guillotined in 1794, condemned by the Revolutionary Tribunal for this role in the old regime's fiscal exploitation. The tax farming system was corrupt by design. A contractor whose profit depended on the spread between what he paid and what he collected had every incentive to collect as much as possible and to find ways to minimize what he remitted. Corruption, brutality, and creative accounting were structural features of the system, not incidental failures. And because the farmers general were so financially intertwined with the crown, lending it money, managing its debts, any reform threatened not just their interests but the state's own creditworthiness. France could not easily reform tax farming because it had borrowed so much money from the farmers general that it needed them. The revolution that abolished the system was preceded by a fiscal crisis that the system had largely caused. The history of taxation in colonial settings reveals how fiscal instruments designed for metropolitan populations became tools of dispossession and control when deployed against subject peoples. As we come to the end of our journey, you might notice how taxation feels now, not just as an obligation or a grievance, but as something older and stranger and more fundamental. We have traveled far tonight, from the clay tablets of Sumer to the digital ledgers of the present day, from the fields where Egyptian scribes measured flood-touched soil to the parliamentary chambers where constitutional principles about consent and obligation were forged in argument and sometimes in blood. We watched empires extract and collapse, watched revolutions abolish what centuries had built, watched ordinary people find ways to resist and survive and sometimes remake the systems that pressed down on them. We saw how wars transformed taxation, how ideologies twisted it, how technology both enabled it and challenged it. And through all of it, the core negotiation remained. What do we owe one another through the mechanism of the state, and who gets to decide? If you are still awake and you would like another slow journey through the past, there will be a next video waiting for you on the screen. You can simply let it play and keep following the thread of discovery wherever it leads. And if this episode brought you calm curiosity, you might like, subscribe, or leave a comment. It helps the channel reach more listeners who need a softer place to land. But for now, you do not need to navigate anything at all. Let your jaw unclench, let your shoulders drop. Feel your breathing find an easier rhythm in and out, like a tide that knows exactly where it belongs. Imagine the last light fading behind a quiet horizon and a steady world moving forward without effort. Sleep well and good night.